TopMedTalk.
This is TopMedTalk, the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. The EBPOM World Congress is taking place this year between the 7th and the 9th of July at the British Library in London. Check out ebpom.org now. Welcome to a new series here on TopMedTalk, TopMedTalk Classics. This piece is a talk from 2018. Sir Bruce Keogh, giant in the world of healthcare, a British surgeon, a physician who specialised in cardiac surgery. He was, until 2018, Medical Director of the National Health Service in England and National Medical Director of the NHS Commissioning Board. The NHS is, of course, a national institution beloved by the people of the UK, and this talk was given on its 70th birthday. EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine, celebrated this fact with a talk that gets right to the heart of why the institution is so special, also how it can move forward in the brave new world we find ourselves in now. We think this talk is absolutely fantastic, remarkably prescient, and could easily have been given yesterday, really. Have a little listen, we hope you enjoy it, and don't forget you can check out the TopMed Talk archive. All of our podcasts are freely available on topmedtalk.com.
I'm delighted to welcome Sir Bruce Keogh to the stage. Bruce, as many of you will know, is our recently retired Medical Director of the National Health Service. Started his life as a cardiac surgeon, talked to us on the stage about 12, 13 years ago, which we remember very fondly. Most of you will know the NHS is 70 years old this week. It's quite a special moment. There's lots of changes in funding coming, lots of changes about the way that we do things. And I'm really grateful for Bruce for giving us the Ernest Henry Starling Plenary Lecture of 2018, which will be our NHS 70 years on. Bruce, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, man. Can I just say thanks so much for the invitation to come and say a few words. I think it was 2008 that I was here last. Somebody reminded me that I was then talking about the 60th anniversary of the NHS. While I was waiting to come in, I was watching Prime Minister's Question Time on my mobile phone. It's a sort of sad thing you do when you've been in the job that I've been in for a while. And I was reminded of Dickens' remarks, where he said it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, the epoch of incredulity, the season of light, the season of darkness, and the spring of hope and the winter of despair. And I think we're living in a very febrile kind of political environment at the moment. And I'm equally reminded of something that Bevan said round about the time that he was arguing for National Health Service. He said, discontent arises from a knowledge of the possible as contrasted with the actual. And when you think about that, that's really quite a profound statement. I've also found myself reflecting on the personal observation that I think the tectonic plates of politics, leadership, power, and public expectations are shifting, not just in this country, but around the world. We're seeing increasing dissatisfaction with the institutions of government, the institutions that are meant to be looking after people, whether they happen to be in Europe or whether they happen to be in Washington. This is fueled by the economic consequences of the 2008 global financial crisis, coupled with the technological power of instant communication. And so it's breeding a sense of localism and a sense of commentary and a sense of different expectations. We've seen it with the election of Donald Trump in North America. We've seen it with the Brexit referendum in this country, and we've seen it to some extent with the junior doctors signalling discontent about not just the way they were being treated in the NHS, but equally, I think, concern about the future of the National Health Service. And Darwin is attributed as having said, I don't think it was him, but he gets the credit anyway, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but it's the most adaptive. And I find myself thinking there are many healthcare systems around the world. None of them are perfect. We do not have a perfect healthcare system. We never will because of the nature of the progression of science and healthcare. And all are struggling with pretty serious climate change. They're having to deal with the winds of changing demand. So the demand for our NHS going up about 4% per year. Rapidly escalating cost of drugs. Our annual drugs bill is about £16 billion. It's going up at 7% per year. So that's 7% of a big number. And changing public, professional, and political expectations. And it's also having to deal with the darkness, all of them, of financial constraint, whatever form that might take. But the United States don't have enough money to run their healthcare system. You see that being debated in the Senate. Germany don't have enough money. France doesn't have enough money. We don't feel we have enough money, and people in Zimbabwe don't feel they have enough money. So the solution lies somewhere in the intellectual capital of people working in healthcare systems. But we've been here before. So given that this is sort of the last talk of the day and nobody really wants to hear too much data, let me just ask you to imagine it was 1947 and we were thinking of establishing a health service. The first 3 months of the year saw a terrible winter with a shortage of fuel, so people were getting cold. April saw the worst floods in the country for 53 years. In May, the exchange rate with the dollar changed, so that the price of foodstuffs went up. It had also gone up as a consequence of the floods and the prolonged winter. And bread was rationed for the first time, having never been rationed before. In September, the meat ration was reduced from what it had been during the war. The bacon ration was halved in October, and in November, potatoes were rationed. Not a great time to have a big debate about spending a load of money on a health service, you might argue. But actually, it leads you to the hypothesis that great things can come out of hard times. And I was traveling on the tube recently, and I bumped into a consultant colleague from St. Thomas's. It was about 11 o'clock in the evening, so I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions as to what kind of nick he was in. But he was sitting on the other side of the tube, and he leant over, he said, "Bruce," he said, "how bad do things have to get before we actually change?" And there's some merit in that particular question. So I'm going to invite you just to sit back and think, do we have a track record of being able to do stuff in this country? Can we change? I'd like you to think about our contribution to global medicine in terms of science. Imagine you lived in a country that had postulated the theory of evolution, that had unraveled the double helix, that held the intellectual property for most of the nucleic acid chemistry, that had developed the chemistry behind the contraceptive pill, that had discovered antibiotics, that had done the first stem cell transplant, the first blood transplant, that had developed the ability to stop and start the heart electively, which was the basis of my previous specialty, or in technology that had invented the clinical thermometer, the intraocular lens, the artificial hip, the laryngeal mask, the ECG, the MRI scanner, or the CT scanner. You might think, well, that country's made a reasonable contribution to global medicine. Imagine if that country also had 4 of the top 10 universities in the world. Although, to be fair, some are drifting down. But it's good for the purposes of the talk. Imagine also if that country had twice as many Nobel Prize winners for medicine or physiology per capita of population than any other major Western country. Imagine also if, in terms of publications, it had 1% of the world's population, funded 3% of the world's research, produced 6% of the world's medical research papers, and 16% of the highest ranked papers, highest cited papers. You would think that's not a bad country to pursue a medical career in. Imagine also if you thought that country ranked number 2 or 3 on the Global Innovation Index put together by INSEAD and the World Intellectual Property Organization. You'd think that's okay. And then if you thought, well, that country also has 5,000 life science companies employing 235,000 people with a £64 billion turnover, and a pharma industry and medtech industry responsible for 10% of all the country's exports, you might think that's not bad, given that financial services are our biggest export. You think that's not bad. But if you could link all of that to the biggest semi-integrated healthcare system in the world, you could start to conjure up a hypothesis that we could, with a following wind, have the best healthcare system in the world. And I still believe that's possible. I think it's a stone's throw away. There'll be hours of debate about the size of the stone, the type of the stone, the geology of the stone, how big it is, where it is, who's going to throw it, and how far. But the point is, there is a stone. And I think we're in just as good a position, I'll come right back to this at the end, as any other healthcare system to tackle some of the problems. We have quite a significant substrate. We have 440 million pharmacy visits a year, 360 million GP visits, 100 million visits to outpatient departments, 100 million visits to community services. We have 24 million telephone consultations. We have about 9 million ambulance journeys. We have 16 million admissions to hospital and about 24 million attendances at A&E a year. So there's a lot of activity going on. And on top of that, we have 1 billion prescriptions a year. There is more activity through the NHS spine in terms of transactions by a factor of several-fold. I've heard two figures. I've heard 2 and 4, so I'm not quite sure which one's true. But in either event, it's big. 2 or 4-fold as many transactions as go through all the debit and credit cards in the country in a day. And that gives you some idea of the magnitude of the operation that we're involved in. Now, change is complex, and one of the reasons it's complex is because we have, frankly, such a fragmented NHS. We have a lot of different organizations. There are advantages and disadvantages to that. We have 137 acute trusts, 17 specialist trusts, 56 mental health trusts, 35 community trusts, 10 ambulance services, 7,800 and falling GP practices, and 853 private providers of services on over 7,000 sites. So trying to get coherence of change in that number of organizations, all of which have their own leadership and their own views, is quite tricky. Now, I was appointed medical director of the health service in 2007, and in March 2008, the global financial crisis struck, at which point there was a decision taken to take 40% of management costs out of the NHS, which happened over the course of the following year. And that, of course, was the year of the 60th anniversary of the NHS, when Darzi, a colorectal surgeon, was a Minister of Health in the Lords, and he led what was known as either the Darzi Review or High Quality Care for All across the NHS. And he came to 3 conclusions. One was we'd kind of dropped the ball on quality over the years. The second was that clinical leadership was kind of sitting over here and the rest of the NHS was over there. And finally, that we weren't focusing enough on personalization. And then personalization got into the kind of political lexicon and just meant different things to everybody. But in my view, it covers a spectrum from just being decent to people when they show up in your clinic, offering the same kind of courtesies you might offer someone coming into your own home, right through to the hardcore pharmacogenetics. And a quality framework was set out. I won't go into the details of that now. Actually, I might. And the reason that I'm going to go into it is because it does have some links actually with Duke, funnily enough. It's strange working in the Department of Health as a bureaucrat, because there's a bunch of rules that you can't even begin to understand. Not least of all, you're not allowed to write your own letters, you're not allowed to put entries in your diary, you're not allowed to open your own post. But I bumped into Darzi in a corridor once. He said, I want you to develop a quality framework for the NHS. And I thought, wow. I wasn't sure whether he was joking or not. So I went back up to my office and I was just thinking about it. And the post came, and in it there was a parcel. This was about 40 minutes after we had had the conversation. And in the parcel was something from someone called Sheila Leatherman, who's a health policy person who works at Duke. And she had done an assessment of the NHS. And I said to the people in the office, do you mind if I open this? And there was a debate, and then they said yes. So I opened it, and I paged through it, and suddenly came to a thing saying quality framework. So now I thought, what do? I thought, how long before I go back to Ara and say I've done it? I thought, maybe another 10 or 15 minutes would be fine. So I went back down, we rang Sheila and said, can we plagiarize? And the answer was yes. But she sort of thought that there were 7 things that would lead to improvement in quality. The first was to define quality. We didn't have a clear definition of what that meant. The second was we should measure it. Third was that we should reward people for quality rather than just penalizing people, which is our general kind of financial strategy. The fourth was we should put leadership in place to enable those things to happen. The fifth was that we should develop academic endeavor, and that led to the concept of the academic health science centers and subsequently to networks. And the sixth was that we should kind of regulate to have our gains, and I've forgotten what the seventh was, but you get the idea. It was a fairly structured thing. And we were making progress with that when in 2010 there was another election. And just as that was beginning to bite, we had a coalition government with Andrew Lansley coming in as the new Secretary of State with his own views as to the way things should be done. We managed to get him to hang on to a definition of quality, which, as most people know, was in the domains of effectiveness, safety, and patient experience. But he summoned me and he said, I want you to make clinical outcomes the currency of the NHS. And that had been an interest of mine for some time, and that seemed a great challenge. And I got some guys in my team to think about it, and we had a smart guy who didn't have a health background, actually. He'd come from the Cabinet Office. He rang me about 48 hours later. He said, Bruce, he said, I think I've got it. He said, doesn't matter what healthcare system you're thinking of, it should do 5 things. He said, firstly, it should stop you dying prematurely from things that it can. Now, that's only a small proportion of illnesses. There's some major determinants of early mortality or education, tobacco usage, that kind of stuff. But he was referring to cardiovascular disease and things like that. The second thing is it should help you live well with a long-term condition. The third thing is it should help you get better from a recoverable illness, broken leg, cataract operation, something like that. All of that fitted neatly into the domain of clinical effectiveness. He said that it should also treat you decently, and that was about patient experience. And finally, it should treat you safely. And I'm quite clear in my own mind what safety means. Safety is about accepting the concept, the notion that people recognize that their disease has a risk, recognizing that treatment may or may not carry some degree of risk. The patient makes a value judgment on that. What they should never have to take into account in that equation is the way we design, deliver, or execute our services. They should never have to bear in mind that that could adversely affect the risk. And we set about on that, trying to develop simply some very 50 high-level measures for the NHS to give us a feel for whether things are moving in the right direction. And broadly speaking, they are. But in the meantime, we tackled a number of problems. Now, I've been a little bit disappointed with some of the media coverage on the NHS over the last few weeks, where much of the focus, there's been some celebratory stuff, but some of the focus has been quite critical in a way, and I accept the need for that kind of diagnostic criticism, because if you don't make the diagnosis, you can't treat the problem. But we have made some big gains, and it hasn't always, sadly, come from people working in the NHS. MRSA was an example. So in 2003-04, when I was a surgeon working in Birmingham and kind of prowling the ITU, we had 7,700 cases of blood-borne MRSA in the NHS a year. And I remember my secretary said to me once, she said, you've seen this stuff from the Department of Health. They want to halve MRSA rates. And I thought to myself, what are those guys smoking? Just come down to our ITU. You've got old patients, sick patients, transplant patients with, immunosuppressants and so on and so forth. What do they expect? Now, the thing that had driven that was the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail had been having a go about MRSA on a daily basis. And eventually John Reid, who was the Secretary of State, a guy with a history degree, he just got fed up with it. And he summoned the chief nursing officer and just said, I want MRSA halved in 3 years. And then, he made a political announcement. And the question was, nobody really knew what to do. But in the event, a plan was put in place. And by 2015 and 16, there were only 817 cases. That's an over 90% reduction. And what's always niggled at me is that the ambition to do that came from outside the clinical professions. It didn't come from inside. And yet we knew from the days of Semmelweis exactly what we should do because the strategy wasn't hugely different. Anyway, I leave that as a reflection. I think a next learning point I had was I used to be summoned to various select committees in Parliament from time to time. Anyway, I got summoned to talk to a parliamentary committee on venous thromboembolism. And there was a group of people, it was a room about this size, and there were probably 150 people in there. A lot of them were researchers, and they were campaigners to do stuff for venous thromboembolism. I was a bit skeptical because I knew they were funded by anticoagulant people. Anyway, the evidence was presented that loads of people, 38,000 people were dying in our hospitals from VTE, and 25,000 of those were preventable. Seemed a big number to me, but nevertheless, there was no argument among the researchers about the numbers. And then they turned on me and said, you need to mandate venous thromboembolism prophylaxis. The first person to say that was the president of the Royal College of Surgeons, John Black. He said, I did my thesis on this 40 years ago, and nothing's changed. And then the president of the Royal College of Physicians stood up and said exactly the same. He said, nothing's changed, you've got to mandate it. And what I was trying to do was not mandate stuff. So I said, look, it's not my job to tell you guys what to do. And, I talked about clinical freedom and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, as I was walking back to my office, a penny dropped. They weren't asking me to tell them what to do. They were saying, make it easy for us to do what we know needs to be done. And so I got hold of the 10 regional medical directors and all the college presidents, and we said, what should we do? Shall we tackle VTE? And the answer was yes. And what I learned from that was that where you had a common clinical consensus that something could be tackled, I could then easily go to the NHS Management Board or whatever forum was the appropriate place and put the financial and other levers in place to make stuff happen. And whilst there was debate about the value of venous thromboembolism assessment of people coming into hospital, it was broadly agreed it was a good thing. And we went from, we couldn't measure it at first, but somewhere between, we thought 25 and 40% of people being assessed to well over 90% within 18 months, which is one of the fastest changes the NHS has ever seen. And the thing that made that possible was the fact that we had all the colleges saying this is the message, a unity of purpose from the clinical professions. And by colleges, I'm including the Royal College of Nursing and the Royal Pharmaceutical Society and others. And so the lesson there was when you have common purpose between managers, policymakers and clinicians, you can make good things happen quite quickly. The next thing we came into trouble with was trauma centres. So the Public Accounts Committee got upset. They said, in America, they've got big trauma centres, much better than here. We were in the process of trying to develop trauma networks. And Keith Willett, who was the National Clinical Director for Trauma, set about setting up a series of trauma networks and designating major trauma centres. And we ended up with 27 major trauma centres and 22 networks. And then it started to get ugly because, again, the Daily Mail started to say this is just a cost-cutting exercise. You guys are killing people. They're going to die in the back of the ambulance. They have to go past a regular A&E. This is not good. And all sorts of things happened. But in the first year of operation of those networks, the odds ratio for survival with people with an injury severity score of greater than 8 went up by 15%. In the second year, it went up by 30%, and in the third year, it went up by 50%. And the variability reduced quite substantially. So sometimes these things that are right to do don't necessarily get the kind of reception that you hope. Similarly, with hip fractures, some guys from UCL wrote to me in the early days saying that they wanted to set up a database for hip fractures. I thought, well, good luck with that, because I'd tried setting up one for cardiac surgery, which took 10 years. But they were much better than me. They did it quite quickly. And then they used it for measuring a whole bunch of things. So we put a payment system in place for hip fractures, which kept 19% of the tariff reserved for 10 things that had to be done, like you had to have your operation in 36 hours, you had to have proper joint care, you had to have a falls assessment, a bones assessment, and so on and so forth. In 2010-14, only 24% of people having their hips fixed had all 10 criteria. And by the end of 2014, it was up to 64%. And now over 90% have 9 out of the 10 things done. And the length of stay went down by 6 days for hip fractures. And not dissimilar sort of endeavor to the kind of things that you guys are discussing here at the moment. So big things can happen when the right systems are put in place to enable people to do what they want. Similarly with myocardial infarction, 99% of people who are eligible now, according to the BESIS database, get primary PCI. 77% get it within 150 minutes of picking up the telephone. That's very impressive. And the median door-to-balloon time is 41 minutes. I've seen people advertising, when you're traveling on a plane, door-to-balloon times as being really good, that are slower than that. But this is for the whole country, whether you're in Northumbria or in London. And our secondary prevention has gone up spectacularly. This is as a consequence of a framework to improve things. 98% of all people who have a heart attack end up on antiplatelets, 97 on statins, 96 on beta blockers, and 94 on ACE inhibitors. That's something we should be really proud of in the NHS. Sepsis was the next big kind of clinical thing which we've started to tackle. We've still got some way to go. We started that in kind of 2014. By 2015, we were introducing a bigger focus on sepsis in A&Es. And at that time, at the beginning, only 52% of people who had signs of sepsis were actually being checked for it. That rose to 78 in the space of a couple of years, and people getting antibiotics within an hour rose quite quickly. December last year, screening of people, not just in A&E, but across the NHS, the sample size is not uniform. So you have to take this the way it's meant, but in places that have tried to tackle it properly, screening is up at 87%, and 80% of people are treated within an hour. And I have to say, in the hospital that I chair, every single patient that doesn't get their antibiotics within an hour, that's assessed. So it's taken quite seriously. The other thing that we're introducing, and you'll probably hear more about this next week, is a national early warning system. 10 years ago, the Royal College of Physicians proposed it. Brian Williams, professor of medicine at UCL, has been working on it for a long time. I think we've got something now that's pretty hard and evidence-based and is good. We're expecting that to go national and be mandatory during the course of this year. I was quite horrified to realize that in one area of the country, a high score meant you were doing well, and in an adjacent hospital, a high score meant you were really sick. I mean, if you're moving from hospital to hospital, how are you expected to deal with that without mistakes? In terms of stroke, we've had an interesting experience, similar kind of accusations of cost saving and putting lives at risk. But in London, many of you will know that not long ago there were 32 receiving centres for stroke. We reduced those to 8. And the call to getting to a hyperacute stroke unit time in London is about 55 minutes now. 15% of people are thrombolised. The accusations of people dying in the ambulance have subsided because we've seen an increase in survival, an increase in return to independent living, a reduction in length of stay, and 40% of people going home within 3 days. So that's been another quite significant advantage. The other thing which has caused some difficulty was, this again, frankly, was politically driven. It was driven out of Number 10. They wanted us to estimate how many people in each part of the country, they wanted to know the prevalence of dementia, because they could see it coming as a big problem. And there were a number of studies that were done, and kind of prevalence indicators were drawn up for each CCG, and then a target was set that, according to that prevalence, 2/3 of people, they should diagnose at least 2/3 of people that were expected at having dementia. And this led into direct conflict with a number of people, because the argument was, why would you want to diagnose dementia when you can't treat it? And that's not an unfair question. The response to that is that it's not about treating people. It's about putting structured support in for their families and friends and for the individual. And so I think that's pretty well embedded, but I've seen dementia in my own family, and I've seen a complete change. I'm not talking about me, I've seen a complete change in the way things are treated now. And that, again, was something I was pretty skeptical about at the time. So there are a series of priorities that NHS England is having to deal with at the moment. Cancer, mental health. I had wanted to develop an arithmetic way of developing priorities. That turned out not to be possible. Politics drives a lot of this stuff. Conservatives in the coalition wanted cancer. Lib Dems wanted mental health. Deals were done. But that's the way things sometimes work. But everything that we have to tackle requires, I think, very good and robust clinical leadership. And I think we're now in a position where we have more clinical leaders in the NHS than we've ever had before. We have medical directors of NHS England, NHS Improvement. We have 15 Academic Health Science Network, all of which have a very strong clinical leadership. We have clinical senates. We have 12 of those. We have regional medical directors now, directors of nursing and pharmacists. We have 16 area medical directors. We have 16 national clinical directors. We have 200 clinical leads of CCGs. We have a whole swathe of physicians working in the GIRFT program, which I believe you've heard about, and we have a national quality board. So we're in quite a good position, I think, to tackle the future. We have Brexit going on in the background. I'm not going to say much about that other than at one level it's a diversion, and at another level it's actually a bit of a problem, because it does impact on workforce, it impacts on research, and it will impact on the cost of drugs for this country. That'll be an economic consequence. And so as the NHS goes into the next decade, we have some specific issues. We have more older people than younger people. That means there are fewer tax receipts and increased demands out of the exchequer. And you've seen the debate that's gone on in the media over the last few days about that. We have a different set of expectations from the kind of baby boomers to Generation X, Y, and Z who communicate more. And we have this paradox where we have an older generation that we have to provide care close to home, continuity of care, eyeball-to-eyeball contact, and a younger generation who want immediacy of information. And we will slowly see the transformation of medicine into a kind of knowledge transfer business through different methodologies. So I find myself, in the light of all of this, asking, what would Bevan do now? Dangerous thing to ask, really. But I think he would come back and he would see that the life expectancy of a man has increased from about 65 years to about 80 years. That meant that at the inception of the NHS, half of the men were dead by the time they reached retiring age. Interestingly, it's the same in Russia now that they've just raised the retirement age. So you didn't have the same cost burden that you have now, particularly dealing with older people. He would also see that there should be a big focus on prevention of disease, and that prevention rests with local authorities, metropolitan authorities who deal with housing, education, sport, transport, immunization. And he would see that we have 30% of people in our hospitals don't need to be there, but they're not getting the support out of hospitals to make it easy for people running the hospitals to discharge them with any degree of reassurance. And he would look at that and he would say, oh, well, that's social services and that's run largely by the local authorities again. But what he would see would be, we've created a construct where we have the NHS over here, we have the local authorities responsible for prevention of disease and keeping people out of hospital, and right in the middle we have a philosophical, a bureaucratic, a financial fracture in what, with care that's free at the point of delivery here, and care which is largely means tested over in the local authority areas. And I think he would see that that is affecting the lives of people who live on a normal spectrum. You know, most people live somewhere on a spectrum of being intensely ill, requiring intensive care, to being perfectly okay. Some people in the middle requiring increasing degrees of support related to age and comorbidities, ranging from help from your family to tablets. And that right in the middle of that, we've got this fracture. So I think he would be heading down the direction of a health and social care system. And I think there's a dawning realization that the margins between health and care are becoming increasingly blurred, particularly as the population gets older. But we have a problem, because the NHS is run from above, because the Secretary of State for Health is the executive responsible for the health service, whereas local authorities are answerable to their local electorates. And we have 27 county councils, 201 district councils, 32 London boroughs. We have 18,100 councillors. And they have a different view on things to the NHS view, and a different way of doing things. So I think all of that's going to play out. There will be a number of conflicts that have to be resolved, and my guess is it'll probably require some form of legislation. The future, in my view, is going to be determined by economics. I've already alluded to the fact no one has money. It's the number one driver of all healthcare systems in the world. The second is that people want more comprehensive and more integrated care. And the things which are going to impact on us, I think that we need to respond to, this is about the Darwinian adaptation, is to mobile technology, artificial intelligence. That's starting to come together. When you have Jeff Bezos saying he's linking up with Warren Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway, and they're linking up with JP Morgan to bring the same kind of disruption to healthcare, we need to sit up and take notice, because that's here now. And then finally, genomics and cell and gene therapy. So those, I think, are the big issues for us. And finally, if you'll forgive me, can I just say, at a time that people are going to be asking, is our NHS fit for the future? I would say with the advent of genomics, where you can start to predict at a population level who's likely to suffer from what disease, and at an individual level, we work in a healthcare system where the values that drive it say we pool our resources, whatever those are, whatever Parliament gives us, we pool our resources and we offer the best care we can to every member of the population, irrespective of their ability to pay, their need, whatever their backgrounds, whatever. There's something really fair in that. And so I find myself wondering whether now is the time we should be thinking that with the predictive ability of genomics, we aren't better equipped for the future than many other healthcare systems. And I invite you to ask whether you want to be in an insurance-based system with that kind of medicine on the horizon. Thank you.
TopMed Talk.
TopMed Talk is the broadcasting arm of EdPOM, evidence-based perioperative medicine. Join clinicians from around the world at EdPOM World Congress 2026 between the 7th and the 9th of July at the British Library in London. 3 days of evidence-based perioperative medicine, global insights and expert debate, featuring speakers including Michael Marmot and Ken Rockwood. Go now to edpom.org. That's edpom.org.